Hey everyone, so the first thing that you're probably going to ask me is, the answer is no. I'm not going to take away points if you turn in this project this week. I had a lot of people ask me that. And, because it's the first project of the year, I can have a little bit of leeway. And because, I didn't get these videos out till the end of the weekend. Now, granted, these videos are not required that I send them out, but I do think that it helps. So I'm going to send this out right now. And here's something cool I'm going to do about this video. So this is where we got to last week. We got to where you can click play and you can move your little cube around and it would contain him within a area, right? So this is like our player and he's contained within an area. Now, I'm going to do this a little differently. I've done none of this in Unity before. I mean, I've done it in Unity before, but I have not done this project. I'm going to go through it without having done it, a couple times to practice. So it's going to get a little bit rusty. It might be a little crazy. It might throw me off a little bit, but I'm going to do it in live time so that you can see, and maybe it'll make you feel a little bit better about your speed and the pace that you guys are creating these games at. Even if when you've been doing it for years and years and years, some of these things are difficult, and you have to look around, and I may even have to look in the documentation. Now there is a chance that I'll do it straight through without any issues or problems, and you won't see a single cut in this video, but the odds are against me. But let's take a look. So I wrote down some notes about the steps, but I have not done this yet, so let's see how it goes. So today we're going to be adding a projectile. We're going to want our little cube here to be able to fire projectiles out when we hit the space button. Now the way you do that is by creating a bunch of objects. So remember, I said everything in a video game is objects, and that means everything, even things that you can't see, like spawning points for projectiles. So in this case, we have to create what's called a dummy object. A dummy object is an object that you can't see, but it can do things. So we're going to click on our cube. We're going to go to game object, create empty child. Now, empty child is just a game object that is empty. There's nothing in it, but we can do stuff with it. You just can't see it. But we're going to rename this to shooter. I think that's what the OHS wants you to name it, so we're going to name it shooter. All right, so now the next thing we're going to do is create another object, and you'll see all the little arrows point up, so we can move this object around just like we could the cube or the cylinder or the whatever. We can move it around, but we don't want to. We're just going to leave it right there in the center of our cube because it's where our spawning point for our projectiles is going to be. Now, the next thing that we want to do is create a cylinder. We need a bullet. Right now, the bullet is going to be another object that we're creating. This is going to be a little bit different. Now, we do not want our bullet to be there when the game starts, but we do want it to be an object that we can see. So I'll show you how to create that too. So we're going to go 3D object, and we're going to create a cylinder or capsule, maybe. I mean, you could do a cylinder. Let's do a cylinder. All right, so we're going to do a cylinder. We're going to bring it up. Now, obviously, this does not look like a bullet yet. We need to scale this thing down. So let's scale it down to like 0.1 of that. 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, and I'm just changing the scale of our XYZ. That kind of looks more like a bullet to me. Okay, I'm going to pull it closer to my camera. That's a bullet. Okay, so we have our bullet made. Now the only thing, it doesn't really look like the right color. Let's give it more of a bullety color. So we're going to right click down here in our assets folder. All right, we're going to go to create and new material. So you can already tell like how much slower it is when I don't practice. We're going to go to orange because that's like bullety, I think. And there we go. We have a new material called, we just call it new material. And then we're going to drag it to our bullet. So there we go. We have a bullet now. Awesome. All right. Now, like I said, I'm going to look at notes, but I'm not, we're going to color it and then we're going to add, okay, again. Our bullet needs physics. Now, our empty child object did not need physics because it's not a real object, but our bullet needs rigid body physics, the same as our cube and our sphere, so that whenever it touches stuff, it acts like a rigid body, right? It's affected by gravity, things like that. So click it on our bullet. We're going to go to add component, physics, and we've done this so many times, that's why I'm going so fast through this, and rigid body. Now, it has rigid body. It has mass. It has angular drag, it has all those awesome things that every single rigid body object in the world has. All right, so the last thing, so the only thing we're going to do is that's different for a bullet is we're going to change one of its constraints. So I want you to click on the bullet, and you haven't done this before. Click on constraints under rigid body in the inspector. All right, and we're going to freeze the position for the rotation on the X and the Y axis, okay? And like I said, all this does is it like keeps the X and the Y, it keeps it from rotating along these two bodies, okay? So good, so we're good with that. And then we're gonna add one more component to the bullet, and this is a new component for you. We're gonna go to add component, and we're gonna add a capsule collider. Now the cool thing is Enter Unity. If you, depending on how your settings are, you may have it already added. If you don't, go to Add Component, Add Capsule Collider. Now what this does is exactly what it sounds like. It will react as if a capsule is colliding with another object. So if our bullet hits our wall, for example, it will bounce off and fall to the ground just like a capsule does if it's hitting a body. So remember, these components, what this is just code. This is just like big chunks of code that you're adding to these objects that is just pre-built for you in Unity. So all that code that you were adding to move around your cube and stuff, that's what these components are. They're just physics. They're just pieces of much larger pieces of code that are much more complicated that we can just add straight through the editor. So it's really cool. It's like Unity's way of helping us out. All right, and then the last thing I believe we're going to do is we're going to rotate. It along the x-axis by 90 degrees so that it is pointing outward. Watch. Pew. There we go. So we want it to lay flat like a bullet. So perfect. Now you could obviously import your own object. Most of you have been doing this. That's great. You can import your own 3D object. You can actually download a real bullet from online and just put it in here. That's fine. All right. And you can scale it to whatever size you want, but all the physics and stuff are going to be basically the same. Okay, cool. So now we're going to name this cylinder. We're going to call it Blast. All right, so I think they wanted us to call it Blast. I'm going to stick with the OHS conventions. Well, if I can type today. So see, you can see how hard it is for me when I'm doing this all live. So now here's where we're going to do something kind of crazy. So we're going to grab this Blast from our hierarchy up here, and we're going to drag it into our assets folder. Now what this does is it creates something called a prefab. A prefab object is an object that we've already created, and we've put it into our game, and we've given it the characteristics that we want. But we don't necessarily want to use it at the beginning of the game. We only want to use it during the game. So we create a prefab so that we can say, hey, create this object at this point. Okay, so maybe later in the game, we want to create this object, right? Okay, so we dragged that down. We created a prefab. It's down here now in our assets. It looks a lot like our materials and stuff, which is really cool. It's easily accessible. And then we want to delete Blast from the scene view. So up here in the scene view, I want you to highlight it, right-click it, and delete it. So now it's gone from our game, but we still have it in our prefab. So that exact same object can be brought into our game at our command, which is really cool. It's there's so many different reasons. Think about anything that's not on the game screen at the beginning is going to be created as a prefab and brought into the game later by some kind of condition. Okay, and in this case, it's going to be hitting the spacebar. I'm going to show you how to do that as well. But we have to get into code to do that, so I know that most of you love that part. So the next thing we want to do is add a new script to the Blast prefab. All right, so let's do that. So we go to our prefab, we click on it, and guess what? We can see the settings again in the inspector, just like it was in our game, which is awesome. So we want to add a component. And this time we're going to add a new script to our component. So we're going to go to scripts, and we're going to create a new script. Let's see. Whoa. Wait. Hold on. Maybe it's in a different part. Add. See, this is where the live video comes in. How do I add a new script? We could probably just add it to the assets and then just connect it to it. But let's see if we can do it from here. There's our handler script. These are blanks. All right, so I don't know. There's a way to do it from there, but instead I'm just going to double click inside, or I'm going to right click inside of our assets folder. I'm going to create a new script, a new C# script. Yay! And we're going to call this script mover. Okay, so it wants you to call it mover, so you're going to call it mover. Now that this is created, let's click back over on Blast. Now let's add a component. Let's add a script, and there's mover. So we're going to add mover to it. So yay, now we go. Now there's no settings in mover because there's no code in mover, so we can't do anything yet, but we're going to change that right now. So we created mover, and then we are going to add some code to mover. So let's double click on mover inside your assets folder, and it will open up Visual Studios or MonoDevelop, depending on which one you're using. Now the OHS tells you to open it up in Visual Studios. I like using MonoDevelop. Most of you guys are using MonoDevelop as well. That's cool. Don't worry about it. I love MonoDevelop, but some people are indifferent about it. So now the first thing we're going to do is create some variables. All right, remember, variables are just names attached to values that can change. They're variables. They vary in value as the game is played. So we want to create two really quick variables. Now I have pre-written my code as always because I don't want to type it out. But remember, you should type out every single letter because that helps you learn how to do it. All right, so let's bring in two variables, and I'll explain the difference in what we put in front of them. Now the first one says private rigid body and then it's called RB. Now, what this is a rigid body variable. That's the type. RB is the name. Private is how accessible is it. Okay, so if you ever put private in front of a variable, that means it's only accessible by this script. We cannot use it anywhere else in our code. We can only use it inside of the class mover, okay, which is the main class of this script. Then we have a public float speed, which is public, remember, is the one that you can go back in the editor, in the visual editor, and you can edit it from here. So we can actually change our speed from the visual editor. We cannot change that rigid body RB, and that's good. You always want to never give access to a variable if you don't want it to be able to be changed. Okay, so we keep most of our variables are going to be private unless we want our to be able to edit it in the the visual editor. So that's just scope. That's all that stuff we talked about scope. But speed and RB, cool. All right, now the next thing we need to do, we added that code, and then the code number 2 needs to go inside of start. Okay, so remember, start is that default function right here, void start. Void meaning it returns nothing. Start meaning that it runs just one time at the very beginning of our game. So when we turn it on, so we're going to paste this little piece of code. So what we're doing inside this code, remember, if you don't really understand it, read it over and over. Code will start to make sense. It's logical. RB is that variable we already created, equals get component rigid body. So all that's doing is it's saying, hey, look into my game and get components that are type rigid body. So all we know, that's most of our things. And then RB.velocity. So velocity is just a component of our new variable, which is our rigid bodies. Transform.forward times speed. So we're saying how fast we want it to move. You multiply that by the speed that we designate. Okay, so this is all just very basic game design movement. Okay, these are like all things that you're going to do most of the time whenever you're creating a game. And that's it. Yeah, that's it. The code 2. Yep, and we're going to save it. So that seems easy, right? We're just setting speed to our, we want to be able to edit the speed of our mover object. Now remember, just because it's only looking at the rigid body that this script is connected to, which is our bullet, right? So it's not going to look at every rigid body in our game. It's only going to look at the bullet because that's what this is attached to. If we attach this script to our cube or our sphere, then our speed variable would be applied to those as well. But it's just going to be applied to the cube because that's what's connected to this script. So we're going to hit Control S to save. We're going to bounce out and we're going to go over to handler. So handler, again, I'll go back just so you can see how to open that. Once again, just double click handler. Handler is the script that we wrote in the last video, in the last unit that controls the movement of our little square. And we're going to need to add some code to this, okay? So we need to create a few more variables. Right here inside of our public class handler, we're going to create a few more variables. All right, we're going to create 3 public variables and 1 private variable. So I'm going to copy those. I'm going to paste those. All right, so what we're creating is a public variable game object shot. Okay, so that's obviously we need to create an object that is called a shot. That's whenever our bullet comes out. We're creating a public variable called transform, okay, which is, sorry, called shooter, which is just a type transform. So this is the location of our bullet, okay. We're creating a public variable called, that's a float type, which is the fire rate. That's how fast we're able to fire the bullet. So super simple. So remember, anything, and there's many more, variables that you could add to your bullet. I mean, or any of your objects actually. Anytime you want to manipulate a certain aspect of an object, you need to add a variable, and you need to make it type public so that you can edit it from the user. Now we're going to create 1 private called nextFire. We do not want this to be able to change. We're going to hard code this into our code. So we're going to create private. We're going to call it nextFire, and I like to indent private. See, like, so if I have like a public variable and then a private below it, I like to indent it. You don't have to do that. It's not required, but it makes it a little easier to see where my private variables are and where my publics are. And then we're going to add 1 new function. Now this is a super powerful thing in game design. Okay, so let's talk about it. And I'm not going to click it yet. The update function, as we talked about, and it says right here in our comments, update is called once per frame. Okay, so it calls 1 time every single frame. But if any of you have ever used a program like Fraps, you realize that your frame rate is never consistent, right? Your frame rate's always jumping up and down. It's never locked at 60. It's always like bouncing around. It's like from 30 to 120 to 110. Well, that's not always ideal for gaming. For gaming, sometimes we want to lock something in at a certain frame rate, meaning like we don't want you to do this more than 30 times per second, which is pretty common in most game design. Most objects are still on 30 frames per second. Now, obviously, like some things are starting to get higher and be 60 frames, like especially on things like the Nintendo Switch and the Xbox One X. But for the most part, 30 frames is still pretty happy, and it looks pretty good too. So here is how you create something to only work every so many frames that you're going to designate. It's this big awesome piece of code right here. Fixed update. So a fixed update function allows you to determine how many times it's called. Okay, so it's not called, just based on the frame rate of the game and the PC that you're running. It's called based on how many times you tell it to, which is really cool. So we have a fixed update. So we have void, fixed update, it's not returning anything. And then we have some conditional logic here. So we've talked about conditional logic a little bit. We're going to talk about it more in class on Tuesday morning. But if something happens, so if there's an input, right? If the fire one button is pressed, which we're going to set as spacebar, then I want you to fire this projectile. That's what it's saying. Next fire is equal to time plus fire rate. Now remember, it's not so important that you know every single step of this code. It's not important that you know how all of this works. It's just important that you know, like, this is the code that we add to do what we're trying to do, which is fire this bullet. Okay? So, there we are, fire one, and we're going to go in and set what we want that button to. We have this new function here. It uses all of our new variables, which is so cool. And remember, all this code is in the OHS, so I don't want you to think like, I'm just going to make you try to read it off here. It's all in the OHS, so make sure you follow the module. Control S to save both of our pieces of code. Now, I have just done something terrible. Never, ever, ever do all your code at once and then save it and then try to run it. It will rarely work, and you're probably going to find out in just a second. It rarely happens, so you should always save a little bit, go back and try it, save a little bit, But don't do as I do as I say. So let's do this. So we have added our cool thing to our handler. There we go. I'm on my second page of notes now. All right. Now it says click the cube and change. Now we've added all these new public variables to our handler script, right? So when I click on the cube, technically in that component handler, we should see new variables that we can manipulate. So let's click it. Boom, there they are. Handler, look, there they are. They just popped up. Shot, shooter, and fire rate. Those three variables that I did, they're here. And they have new really cool things that we can add to them based on what type that I added. Remember, one was like a transform. There was a couple other ones. One was a game object, one was transform, and one was a float, right? So a float means we can make it into a decimal. So we're going to turn our fire rate to 0.25. Okay, and remember, these are the things that whenever you were playing with a car object, or the car project you were editing and playing around with, you can do that with your own game too. So you can change fire rate to, I don't know, 2 or 3 or whatever. It's probably better if you do it as a decimal, but anyway. And then a couple other changes. We're gonna drag our blast asset into our wait, where's my blast thing? Hold on just a second. Handler. I need to drag blast. Well, hold on. There we go. Where's my... Oh, cube. There we go. It's cube, and I'm going to drag blast into our shot. So we're saying, what do we want to be our object that's shot? We want it to be that blast asset that we created. So you just drag it into that. And I like the drag and drop aspect of Unity. It's pretty cool. You don't have to drag and drop, but, it's easy. And then we want to grab our pointer, all right, which is our shooter, right? Little pointer. From our hierarchy up here on the left, there's our shooter, and we want to drag it into our shooter area. So now it's called shooter, transform. Okay, so it's saying, okay, what shot says, what do you want to come out? And that's our blast prefab. And shooter is saying where? Well, we want it to come out of our empty child element, which is in the middle of the cube. And fire rate is how fast we want it to be able to fire. Okay, so good. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to set up that fire one button. So most of you saw that code and you were like, well, wait a second, what's fire one? Well, fire one is just a button that we haven't designated yet. So we need to go into our project settings and edit what we want that button to be. We want it to be the spacebar. So let's go to edits at the top left. I'm pretty impressed with how smooth this has been going. Edit project settings. Input. I say that, it's probably going to mess up. So you've seen this before. This is all the buttons and what they do. But we're going to look at Fire 1. Fire 1 is the one that we just did. Okay. And we're going to use the space bar. And I can't remember exactly. Positive button. I think that's what it is. Oh, I hope this is right. So positive button, we're going to tap SPACE, no capitals, no quotations, and that will create it as the space bar. Your alternate positive button is mouse 0, which is your left click. So it should, if our space bar doesn't work, that means our mouse should work. Okay, so you can always leave alts, and that's a good thing for games because sometimes gamers use different keys. And anyway, that's not here nor there. So let's do this. Let's try it. I'm very nervous about this, but let's go in and check it out. So we have everything set. Our game's ready. Let's file, save our project, save project, and let's run this thing and see how it goes. All right, so make sure I can still move. All right, I didn't mess anything up, but let me hit space and check it out. Look at that. I am firing a projectile out of this this cube. Okay, so yeah, they're not really going anywhere. All right, they're just kind of falling out, but that's pretty cool. We have created the ability to spawn game objects based on a key click. So this is huge. And if you watch inside of our editor over there, like our hierarchy, you can see that every time we're creating an actual game object, look at this, now they're really popping out everywhere. So this is great. This is cool. This is the kind of stuff that makes me really excited about about game design. Hey, PS on that one. I knew the first questions that were going to come through were, wait a second, this is not a projectile, this is not firing. So I wanted to make sure I jumped on and told you this just at the end. Sorry I didn't put it in the other video. But so basically, remember, anything you want to edit about your game, if you've created it as a public variable, you can edit it from the display. And luckily for us, we did that. When we click on blast in our assets folder, you're going to see our assets area. You're going to see mover script. And right there is our speed public variable that we created. And we can change this to pretty much anything we want. So let's change it to 30, not 306. That would be crazy. And hit Control Save. Now, let's jump into here and I'll show you now. You can fire it and it fires it much faster. Okay. Now, there's one problem. Do you see how? Look at how my cube is reacting, right? And if you're in physics, you probably know why that's happening because we have not changed any of the settings. So, for example, if we click on our cube, look at the mass of our cube. The mass of our cube is 1. When we click on our blast assets, the mass of our cube or our little cylinder is 1. Okay, so try manipulating those masses and the sizes and things, the angular drag, and you'll see that you'll start to get more control over it. Now, and this is just completely based on what you want to do with your game. Okay, so if it's like a gun, obviously you want the gun to be able to take the brunt of the force and the bullet to just fly straight out. But there might be a reason why you want them to be the same mass. But anyway, just play around with these settings a little bit, get to know them, and just make sure that they are close to the way your game design document says your game will be. So I can't wait to see you guys in class on Tuesday.